بینەرانی بەڕێزم کاتەوە هەموو کاتێکتان شاد و کامەران خۆشحاڵین کە لە هەڤپەیڤینێکی نوێ جارێکی کە دەگەینەوە خزمەتتان. هەڤپەیڤینی ئەم جارەمان لە دەڤەری بارزانەوەیە کە سەمپۆزیۆمێکی تایبەت هەیە سەبارەت بە جینۆسایدی بارزانیەکان بە شێوەیەکی تایبەت و جینۆسایدی گەلی کوردستان بەگشتی. بۆ ئەم هەڤپەیڤینە میوانێکی تایبەتمان لەگەڵە کە یەکێکیش بۆ لە پانێلیستەکان ئەویش زۆر بەڕێز دکتۆر مارکۆ ئەتێلا. How are you? Dr. Marco, thank you very much. Thank you for this interview with Kurdistan 24. We appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, Dr. Hawari, let me ask you about your feeling. You are now attending this symposium about the genocide of Barzani. How do you feel? And you are one of the participation in it.
It's a great honor to be here, and it's important to draw these comparisons between different cases of genocide. So I think there are many comparisons that can be made between the genocides that happened to the Kurds, particularly in the 1980s, and what happened to the Bosniaks in Bosnia just a few years later in the 1990s. It tends a group targeted for destruction by a supremacist ideology because of its desire for national autonomy and self-affirmation. Yeah.
Right. Doctor, what's the importance of this symposium in this time, especially? What's the importance of it? Why it's important?
I think the important thing is that genocide is remembered to prevent it from happening again. So you always have to draw the lessons that people such as the Kurds who experience genocides, they could be targeted in a new genocide tomorrow. So we have to be prepared for that, and we have to also make sure that those who have suffered in previous genocides, their memory is not forgotten. That we know that we preserve that memory and treasure it, and that's an important part for any people that's experienced that to preserve those memories.
Okay, Dr. Marco, are there any way to prevent any new, let us say, any new genocide, not just against the Barzani, against the whole Kurdish people? Are there any way to prevent that? Do we need a legislation from United Nations Security Council? In which way we could prevent not any new genocide would happen to the Kurdish people?
So I think, to be completely honest, it's very difficult to get the international community to behave ethically and to rely on it. I don't think any threatened people should ever rely on the international community for protection. I mean, because look what happens in Ukraine, even with American support, the genocidal Russian regime is still advancing, and there's talk about abandoning it. So you can never be certain. But nevertheless, there are things that threatened peoples like the Kurds can do, and I think it's very important to have active diplomacy and lobbying and to make sure the message is brought across to the international public. So the Kurds are fortunate in that they have quite a positive image among the Western public. So people who've heard of the Kurds have a positive image of them, and we know about the Saddam Hussein's genocide. We didn't know perhaps so much in the 80s, ordinary people, but we know much more now. So it's important to try and get the message out there and make sure that the Kurds are not forgotten. But even more important, I think, is for Kurdish people to take the steps they can to organize their defense, so that if there is another attack on them, they're in a position to defend themselves as best they can. And that applies to every threatened genocide. People threatened with genocide, same with the Albanians in Kosovo. They can't necessarily always trust the Americans, but they can prepare for the next attack if it happens.
Dr. Marco, there is a question. As you know, I'm not talking about the whole population of the Kurdish people. It's more than 40 million, which is divided between 4 countries. But if we talk about here, South Kurdistan, is it one of the possibility to create a state for the Kurdish people, which it's a right for the Kurdish people to have their own state? Is it not the best way to prevent any kind of genocide against the Kurdish in the future?
Absolutely. I certainly hope to live long enough to see that such an independent Kurdistan emerge. Kurdish people have the right to self-determination, to national independence in all those areas which want to be part of it. So in principle, one day Kurdistan and Iraq become independent, and the neighboring states could decide by referendum where the boundaries should be. So Kurds in Turkey, Syria, Iran have the right to join an independent Kurdish state. That is what I would like to see. I think that would be the best solution. Of course, we have a lot of forces opposed to that. It would be hard to overcome. But I think there's a good chance we have here an autonomous Kurdistan in northern Iraq, which I think is a good basis for eventual Kurdish independent statehood.
Right, Dr. Marco, about the psychology of those people who lost, a lot of people of them. I mean, families being destroyed. Too many, not just the Barzanis, I mean, the whole Kurdish people in 1988, in the Anfal campaign, they killed more than 200,000 Kurdish people. 8,000 Barzani, they were buried alive. So in terms of psychology, what should be done for those families who lost most members of their families?
I think it's important to offer sort of counselling services to those who have survived. That's one thing. I mean, people have trauma, and all people who've suffered those kind of traumas, they may need sort of counselling from professionals to help them. But it's also important that they receive justice and that those who are guilty of those crimes are punished. I mean, it was in the 80s, so many of the perpetrators are undoubtedly still alive and should be brought to justice as well as can be. I mean, I know many survivors wait many years for justice. So it was just a few years ago that the perpetrators of the Cambodian genocide were finally convicted. These men like Noan Che in his 90s, who was finally convicted of the genocide, and the Cambodians had to wait many years to get that justice. But it's important that it should happen eventually. So perpetrators have to be punished, and of course we have to make sure that people educated here in Kurdistan and elsewhere internationally, that we know about the genocides, that we know that these crimes happened, and that everyone should be aware that they happened, that they shouldn't be forgotten.
Right, Dr. Marco. Until now, this is, I mean, this question a bit sensitive, but I would like to ask you about it. Why, until now, the Iraqi authorities, until now, they don't take any responsibility for this genocide against the Kurdish people? Why they don't take any responsibility in Germany? Until now, as far as I know, they paid $86 billion to the Jew until now, but the Iraqi authority, they don't take any kind of responsibility.
It's a sad fact, but that is more the norm than
what
the
should
exception.
be done?
Yes. I mean, the Germans are an exception in that they have largely faced up to their crimes in the Holocaust. Most nations that carry out genocide don't admit to it. So Serbia doesn't really admit to its crimes in the 1990s, or the bare minimum. I mean, it doesn't pay compensation. Turkey doesn't admit to the crimes against the Armenians. Nationalists do not like to recognize their crimes, and most people are nationalists. So when it's a question of you accepting that your nation is responsible, your state is responsible for genocide, most states and most people don't want to accept that responsibility. That's unfortunate. It's a lack of liberal democratic consciousness, and I hope that Iraq and other nations will evolve to the point where they actually are ready to say, yes, we carried out, our state carried out these crimes, we owe it to the victims to pay them compensation and to recognize these crimes.
Dr. Marco, let me ask you about the coalition troops. It's not the real troops, but there are kind of coalition, American, Britain, France, Italy, staying in Kurdistan. What's the importance of staying all this coalition in Kurdistan in terms of preventing any kind of genocide from Iraq, to be honest with you?
It's very important that they should remain. We absolutely have to keep our troops in Kurdistan to protect Kurdistan from any future genocide, from any of the possible enemies, whether from Iraq or from Iran or from Turkey. In principle, we should not allow these countries to attack the Kurds, and that's why it's very important to make sure that the pressure is put on Western politicians, the issues kept alive in the media in the West, in the public eye, so that we know that the Kurds are there and they need this support, solidarity. That we should never again allow what happened in the 80s and early 90s, where Saddam's regime carried out the genocide essentially with Western acquiescence, which was a great stain on Western reputation. That should happen.
Dr. Marco, now there are kind of Arabization in Kirkuk, Khanaqin, or they call it disputed area. It's not, to be honest with you, it's not disputed area. It's part of Kurdistan. But there's a kind of Arabization, a daily Arabization by the Iraqi authority. You don't see that's a kind of genocide as well against the Kurdish people?
Yes, absolutely. It's an ongoing genocide. If you think about the whole process of the attempt by the successive regimes in Iraq to forcibly break Kurdish national existence in Kurdistan, and to forcibly assimilate the Kurds or destroy them where they won't be assimilated, then that is part of his ongoing process, and they aren't able to fully complete the genocide, but nevertheless the Arabization is what they're doing what they can as part of this process, and it's a disgrace. The Western powers should never have allowed Iraq to regain control of Kirkuk. That was a mistake. We should not have allowed that to happen. But yes, we should certainly this should be made aware of the fact that this Arabization is ongoing, and this is a very unfortunate regime we have now in Baghdad, close to Iran, very regressive regime, chauvinistic, religious fundamentalist.
Okay, Dr. Marco, accept this kind of symposium. It's important, very, very important, to make people know about what happened of kind of this atrocity or genocide against the Kurdish people and Barzani people as well. Except that, what should be done plus of this symposium? What should be done to make people around the world to know what happened to the Kurdish people?
Just to try, of course, it's very difficult to get the public anywhere to kind of focus on something that isn't their immediate concern, but nevertheless it's important to try and have these outreach programs, to have sort of visiting lecturers and sort of maybe fund foreign students or visits to try and get the message to the outside world as much as possible to keep the memory of the Kurdish genocide in the eyes of the Western public, the international public, to make sure that they remember this genocide or learn about it for the first time, however they, to make sure that they remain aware of it. To do as much diplomacy, political academic diplomacy as you can to sort of to keep the issue alive. And it's not easy when there's a lot of competition for other causes, but nevertheless it has to be done.
So, Dr. Marco, do you see any kind of international responsibility? Are there any kind of responsibility to prevent a new genocide against the Kurdish people?
Right. Well, there's certainly very different levels of international responsibility. We are signatories of the Western states are signatories of a genocide convention. So under that genocide convention treaty, the Western states are obliged to stop genocides happening anywhere in the world. So there's that responsibility. Then there's also the more direct moral responsibility, the fact that Kurds have been our allies, against Saddam Hussein. So the Kurds have been very good allies to the United States and Britain to our alliance in the wars, against Saddam Hussein and then against the insurgents who followed Saddam Hussein, the extremist insurgents, against Al-Qaeda, ISIS. In the sense that there's that connection, and we have a duty as allies to stand by the Kurds in the face of any new genocidal threat. It was a great disgrace that when in the first George Bush drove Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, he encouraged the Iraqi people to rise up. When they did rise up, he didn't then support the uprising. That was a real disgrace. And I think the second George Bush did much better in liberating Iraq from Saddam Hussein and establishing a more secure protection. We have to build upon that. That has also created the kind of responsibility to continue with that policy, to make sure that the Kurds are not again abandoned to any future genocidal threat. Yeah.
Right, Dr. Marco, the last genocide, which the ISIS did it against the Yazidi Kurds in recent years. So doesn't mean that it's a big responsibility now for the international community, for United, for all international community in general, to have or to realize that reality that the Kurdish people is surrounded by its own enemy. Then this is their responsibility to protect them. This is not a real thing and a true story for them.
Yes, it's absolutely a responsibility to protect the Kurds, and both on the basis of international law and the basis of its kind of ethical responsibility arising from an existing relationship. I mean, if you think about how, say, Turkey is supposed to be an ally of NATO, but Turkey was obstructing NATO enlargement to try and extract petty concessions. Wouldn't let Finland and Sweden join for many years, and is often not a very good ally, attacking the Kurds in Syria, pursuing this kind of selfish policy. I mean, Kurdistan has been a better ally than Turkey. I mean, it just makes no sense to, when you have a region like the Middle East, which is so full of these dangerous regimes and problematic movements and sort of extremism and dictatorship, that you have Kurdistan as sort of a democracy, as rule of law, largely in a secular, moderate, reasonable, and not to sort of then protect it. It doesn't make sense to me that you wouldn't protect Kurdistan.
Dr. Marco, let me come to any kind of legislation by United Nations. Do you think that if, I say if, it happened, any kind of this legislation for protecting the Kurdish people, do you think it's necessary?
I'm a bit sceptical that legislation will bring any results because, I mean, particularly the United Nations is a body that represents its members and many of which are dictatorships and, these sort of fascist regimes and whatever. States like Iran and the former Assad who were members of North Korea in the United Nations. So I don't think this body has much to hope for. You have the Security Council which has Russia and China.
And they are not representing nations, representing states.
Yes, exactly. They're called the United Nations but they represent states. So like China and Russia have permanent seats. I mean, what are we going to do with a body like that? The Chinese are carrying out genocide against the Uyghurs, the genocidal state. So,
all right. Dr. Marco Atella Hawari, thank you very, very much for this interview with Kurdistan 24. We appreciate that.
Thank you very much for inviting
thank
me.
You. بینەرین بەڕێزم هافەیڤینشمان لەگەڵ زۆر بەڕێز دکتۆر مارکۆ ئەتەلا هەواری لێرەدا کۆتایی تا دیدارێکی کە پێگەیشتنەوەیکی تر ئێوە شاد و بەختەوەر بن و کوردستانیش هەمیشە ئاوەتە.